We are to order, and we have several committee members who are joining us via WebEx because they know that germs are not the good things to share. Representative Ruiz is excused. He had a family situation. Is Representative Hubert online? Do you see him? Okay. I know Representative Stogsdill, I believe, is online. Steele and Schmoy are. Okay. I believe the other two will be joining us. If they do join us, please let Michelle know so we record them as present. Okay. We will start with bill introductions, and I believe that our first contestant is is Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just so that we never have a lack of things to do, I've got three different bill introductions. So the first is 25 RS 0552, which is school bus camera legislation. 25 RS 0553, which is introduction of allowing additional $2 million capital outlay levy for security and ADA compliance. And the third one is 25 RS 0782, which is an increase in the minimum expenditures for school districts. And I ask, sorry, what is?
I'll repeat those for you. 0552 is school bus arm cameras. 0553 is allowing districts to add 2 mills for safety and ADA compliance. And 0782 is expanding the limit at which districts do not have to send things out for bid.
Takes it from 20,000 to 50,000.
I find all of those germane, and we'll take them one at a time. 0052, school bus arms. Is there any objection? Seeing none, that bill is introduced. 0553, 2 mil for safety and ADA compliance. Is there any objection? Seeing none, that is introduced. 0782, expanding the maximum rate at which bids must be sought. Is there any objection? Seeing none, that bill is introduced, and I believe that Representative Hill is our next contestant.
Door number 3. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have RS number RS0699, is a scholarship renewal bill. And I forget the name of that scholarship, but
Low-income tax credit, Hope Scholarship,
yeah,
Promise Act.
the tax credit.
Is it Heroes?
What's that?
Heroes, the military.
No, it's not Heroes. It's not the military one. Is it the? It's.
Do you want to read the title of your bill on your draft, or do you just have a pink piece of paper?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. It is.
It's a scholarship that's for private schools, tax credit for people that contribute money to.
It's the low-income tax credit scholarship.
Yep.
Ding, ding, ding. Okay.
I forget the name of that scholarship, but it's that's what it is.
Okay. I find that is germane. Do we have any objection? Hearing none, that is introduced. Did you have another one?
I do have another one, but I don't have the RS number on it yet. So we can still do.
We will allow you to be a contestant tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Because Nick's got I think that RS number for me.
Anybody else have bill introductions? All right, seeing none, we will go on to our agenda, and technology land. If you guys could give me a wave now and then when there's somebody online who has a question that they would like to ask, because I am really bad about remembering that. So we are going to welcome back up to the stage Commissioner Watson and thank him for coming over a second day. I kind of felt like when we were getting the update, we didn't have enough breadth of time to get into all of our questions, and I want us to all really have a good handle on all of the literacy things that are happening in the different parts of our educational process. So, Dr. Watson, I'm trying to recall, did we get to the end of your presentation? We did. So I want to go give you just 2 minutes to say what were the things that you most wanted us to walk away from, and that will help jog our memories and get us focused for questions. And we are just waiting on tech.
What do I want you most to remember? That we are in the process of training teachers throughout Kansas. We're in the mid stages of that, where we have over 8,000 teachers in training, and about a number, 3,000 or so that have completed training. And we should start to see results of that starting with this cycle this spring. And then I have for you, Madam Chair, some maybe opportunities that we might think around how we could move that needle even further with making sure teachers have the knowledge and skills in order to teach reading really well. And Dr. Harwood is here to talk about assessments because you asked, or the committee asked about that last time.
I am so sorry to interrupt you. Technology land. Representative Stogsdill is not finding the WebEx link, and he would appreciate if somebody could send that to him. Okay, that was 17 minutes ago. So, do you see him on? Can we please try again? I want to make sure I include everybody. I'm going to pass my phone down. That's the cell phone number I have for him, and perhaps you guys can text to each other and help him find the solution. And I'm sorry, I'm going to pause this while we get everybody on. Elena and Jason, I have a question. Why don't we, since we're not voting on anything we're hearing today, and he'll have the opportunity to jump in for questions, let's go ahead and get started, or allow you to continue. Thank you.
So somewhat laid out for you what the state board's plan is to increase literacy. Right now, we have about a third of our kids, if we look at grades 3 through 8 and grade 10, that are reading at level 1. We know that seriously limits their ability to do work after high school and through high school. We've reduced that slightly over the last 2 years, but ever so slightly. It's a little bit over one percentage point. Equates to about 5–6%. We need to accelerate that. We're trying to do that with training. And then, of course, we have the new law of the Blueprint for Literacy that we're trying to bring people together of how we can do that even faster. One of the things, Madam Chair, as I think about this work, and if you want to go ahead and, So when we think about the success of each student, if a student cannot read well, they're extremely limited. At another time, not today, but at another time, I'd love to talk to you about STEM, because well over half of the good jobs in our state require high levels of math and science. And I can tell you that we have to get there too, but reading It underpins everything around that. So the state board has said, all right, veteran teachers, veteran teachers are who we're talking about. We first of all took the college, the young people that are in college, and said, when you come out, starting September of this fall, you have to pass an exam on the science of reading. And that's in effect. So what I'm talking about here are veteran teachers. There are two options. This is what I went over with you last time. Letters, which is paid for through COVID relief money, federal COVID relief money, up to expenditure of $25 million since the beginning on the training of anyone in letters, including college professors if they chose to do that. AIMS, Pathway to Proficient Reading, or Keys to Literacy. These are training programs. So they're intense training programs. I'm going through letters myself right now. I mentioned that to you last time. We're not paying for the other two, but districts may want to do that. Right now, there's no one that has completed the other two. There will be more that the state board puts on this list over time. These are all three accredited by the International Dyslexia Association and by our local group internally at KSDE, and then eventually the state board. So I can, if I'm a veteran teacher, by 2028, I can take one of these programs. Again, soon I think we'll have one there from the colleges of Kansas, universities. That'll happen maybe late in the spring. So this list will grow over time. By 2028, I have to either do that or I have to pass an exam. So if I've been doing this and I know what to do, I just take the same exam that we're asking of students who are coming out of the colleges and universities. It's the exact same exam. It's the ETS on sub-reading, or I can take the Pearson exam on reading, or I can take the Center for Effective Reading Instruction. We will pay for that as a state one time for a teacher to take it. So by 2028, veteran teachers in Kansas, the ones in the seat right now teaching in elementary school, have to either go through a training program and pass it, by the way, 80% competency, or they have to do an exam, and it's their choice. Or they will no longer be licensed to teach in a capacity of reading. Now, you may ask, what about the PE teacher or the music teacher? No, they don't have to do this. This is only someone who's going to be teaching kids to read. They can, it's optional, but they're not required. And then they get this seal of literacy on their license, and we're producing seals of literacy currently. We're putting those on licenses now. 2,649 educators as of Friday have completed that. That number will go up. And 184 educators have taken the exam. Most of those are college students, university students, but a handful of those are veteran educators. So there's the number. We're looking at about 2,700 are getting the seal of literacy right now. We're going to need to get that toward around 18,000 over the next several years. So again, we have approximately 18,000 educators in this pool that are teaching someone to read. Elementary teachers, that's the biggest chunk of those. Reading specialists, school psychologists that test to see if a student is disabled in reading, administrators that oversee elementary schools. So if I am a superintendent, and I may take it, but if I'm an elementary principal, I'm required to take it, or assistant principal. And then special ed teachers that again work in an elementary environment. Now I will tell you where we're headed. So this is by 2028. This year, in 2025, the state board will start working on middle school and high school, starting to put that into effect. So we wanted to attack the preschool and elementary teachers. That's approximately 18,000 educators statewide. So the recommendation in the blueprint for literacy that was passed last year, there's a stipend that's paid to teachers that take the Board of Regents course on literacy. That course is not quite developed yet. They're still working on it. It will eventually, I think, go on that list. We're not opposed to that. We support that. we'd like to, for you to consider expanding that and not get into how does someone go on the path to get to that seal of literacy. But if I get the seal of literacy through the state board approved methods, that stipend would be paid to me. That would be the ask. And then that incentivizes our teachers that are doing the hard work. Yes, we're in it together because the state's also going to incentivize, because I have to go back to school in essence, or I have to take an exam to show that. This is just the veteran educators. It's not the new ones coming in. This is the ones we're requiring to have to go back to do this work. And so with that, Madam Chair, I would be happy to answer any questions. Again, Dr. Harwood's here to talk about assessment with you today.
Very good, thank you. Do I have questions? Representative Chauncey? And
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one quick question to start off with. We have 18,000 teachers, 2,649 teachers that are already in the program training, correct?
They've already completed
it, okay. So we still have basically 15,500 teachers, give or take. But according to the testimony we heard last week, these centers should be able to accommodate roughly 1,500 teachers per year. Is that what I'm hearing?
The original blueprint. So we have two things that are happening. The move that the state board did, and then the move that the legislature did last year. In the blueprint, I think the thinking was those that hadn't completed any other form of training, that's about what would be left over, possibly. In this, we're saying, why don't we reward all 18,000 of those that go get the seal of literacy with the stipend? And that may be the confusing.
Well, no, it's just a question. I mean, with 18,000 teachers, they have to go through this letters training is what we're requiring by 2030, correct? All our teachers are supposed to be.
So by 2028, the state board is required that anyone who's teaching in an pre-K or elementary environment must show the science of reading. They can do that by the training programs, as you mentioned. Letters would be one example, or they can take the exam. So what my ask would be is once they do that and show that and get that seal, they would be rewarded with the stipend that right now is only given if I take the university courses in Kansas.
Okay, so.
Was I clear as mud on that, Representative?
Pretty much, but I'll get another question. I'll wait. I'll take it for later if I have time.
okay, in the queue right now, I'll go next to Representative Pishney. I have Representative Schreiber. Anybody else who wants to on the list? Representative Hill. Okay. Representative Pishney may go, and then we'll go to Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Randy, I appreciate you being here with us a couple of times, and obviously I was not involved in the discussions on the blueprint and so forth, and I don't have anything against it. I just simply was not a party to that, so I don't know all the discussions. But something that I said the other day that I'll paraphrase just briefly is that my wife, who's been in the education world for 40 years, 30 full-time, 10 part-time, is my barometer with regard to education things and education programs and new ideas and so forth. And I understand the science of reading and so forth. And I understand with the blueprint and with things that you're charged with at the state board that there's benchmarks and there's things that we need to hold you, all of you accountable for by 28 and 30 and so forth and so on. But it seems like this is something that should have been accomplished a long time ago, and I'm not going to live in the past. That is to teach kids to read, because it's critical for everything. And our son the other day says, well, give them a book and have them start reading. Well, we got to get them to that point. I know that. But you have to understand, too, my family, all of them are avid readers, except maybe Grandpa. But how do we know, I guess, pardon me, Madam Chair, I'm sorry for digressing, but how do we know that we're going to be successful? How do we know that this newer notion is the one that we need to latch onto to help kids read? And before we spend millions of dollars and then we find out this is not the program that we should have done. And I listened to the blueprint presentation and the science behind it and so forth. But I'm concerned about the amount of dollars going into all of this with some uncertainty, if you will, that there's going to be positive results.
Sure, and you should be, right? I mean, we should be asking the questions, what's the return on investment that we will get? When we look at what's taken place over the years that your spouse may, have been in education, there were two compelling research-based methods around teaching reading. I shared with you the Dick and Jane method, and there's always been the phonics kind of a heavy method, and then a blending of the two in the 1990s. But the researchers were always at odds. And so when I went to school, it was a battle. Researchers would come in and say, no, this works, this works. That all ended in the early 2000s when the research came clear and the two compelling camps, if you would, came together and said, now the research is really clear. And where it came out of was really looking at brain imagery of what happened when kids learned to read and where that was taking place. And we couldn't see that in the 60s and 70s. We just didn't have the technology to see that. So if you look at the two reading organizations today, they're not in disagreement where they were when your wife was trained or I was trained. And so that left it up to wherever we went to school to get that information. That has ended. So the research is pretty clear that around 30%, 31% that's in level 1, we think we can drop that toward in half if we get good training and if we get good materials. That's another step to this. And then if we have ways in which we can attack the most severe kids, that still struggle after that. But we'll need to monitor that. If we look and see at other states that maybe have a little bit head start on us in this way, they have done that, especially at grades 3 and 4. What I said last time, we want to do it all the way through high school. No state has really sustained that through the upper grades, but we think we can. I wish I could turn the switch and it happened overnight, but we didn't get here overnight. And so again, as I shared with you, this whole every kid's going to be able to read it, no, not necessarily really well, but I think we can greatly diminish the numbers of that aren't reading well.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. We will go to Representative Schreiber, then Hill, and then Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. You mentioned the stipends for the teachers. Aren't there also stipends if a veteran teacher goes back and gets a new qualification? Are there stipends that are provided
So
for them?
the stipend right now in the blueprint that was passed last year calls for the tuition to be paid for the classes and the stipend to go on completion of those courses.
I guess what I'm asking is, aren't there other areas where teachers go back and get additional education and are they provided a stipend?
Not necessarily, unless maybe the district provides that. Or in some cases, there may be some programs at a specific university that may do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
This is something that you already have in law, but right now it applies only if I take the courses that have yet to be developed by the Board of Regents. Now, I'm not saying we should cut that off because it's going to be good courses, but maybe we ought to expand it to anyone that gets the seal. Because then that would then recognize any teacher who took whatever path they took to get to that seal.
Representative Schreiber, I was kind of wondering, are you thinking maybe moving them over to different pay scale like we do with advanced degrees?
Maybe that's what I was thinking of. I just thought that when teachers went back and got more education, that maybe it was related to the pay scale at that particular district or whatever it was. So I was just trying to get that clarification.
Well, yes, and if they move across the salary schedule, yes, they would receive additional compensation.
Yeah. And if there's time, once you go through the list, I would have a second one, but that's.
Thank you. Representative Hill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple questions, kind of mingled in with comments, but I think the desire to get teachers trained is overwhelming, and the structured literacy doesn't reside in one particular area. And I appreciate your comments about the department training or other ways training too. I mean, there's contractors out there that are training right now. The question is really along the lines of assuring us of the rigorousness of the assessments, because my contention all along on this has been that if the assessments are rigorous enough, it will drive instruction to be successful on those tests. And then I have another quick follow-up question. Is that, how do you assure us of the rigorousness of the test?
So Representative Hale, are you talking about the assessment that the teachers will take or the students?
Yeah, the teachers will take, to get their certificate,
Yes.
yeah.
So the assessments have been also vetted, I'm talking about just the assessment itself, by the International Dyslexia Association, and they have to be above 80% in order to score that. Same with the training. So I'm doing letters right now at the end of that course. You would 2-year course is an assessment that I have to pass with 80% accuracy, or I do not qualify for the seal of literacy. So it's a combination. I just don't do the training and show up. I also have to pass the exam. Now, if I feel like I don't need to take the course because I'm very knowledgeable, I would simply take the exam that college students are being required to take. And both of those have been vetted through the reading associations, and you have to have 80% accuracy to do that.
Okay, I appreciate that and encourage you to maintain that level of competency. The second thing, you made the comment about 30% in level 1. You know that I don't really particularly like the level categories, but I won't go into that today. But the 30%, and you said we can reduce that to 15% or half, is that what you said?
I believe we can.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot of data, and I mentioned this last time, the word illiterate, the word grade level, the word 95% of all kids. When you start getting into those type of things that are thrown out, the research gets a little shaky on what level are we talking about. If we're talking about the 25th percentile reading, I think we can get kids there. Is that reading where the skill level they're going to need to graduate high school and post-secondary? I don't think so. So we want to get that higher. So yes, I mean, I think we can drop that significantly, I think toward in half.
So my question really is about dyslexia. And I would guess that those 15% that we're going to have challenges with, many of those kids are probably struggling with dyslexia. How does the dyslexia component work in with letters? At what point, I mean, we have a special education classification for dyslexia. Now, we also have an at-risk classification. At what point do those three all work together to?
So you'll hear us use the term tier 1. That's the instruction that every kid gets. So I'll go to a classroom, I'm in first grade today, every kid's developing. That needs to be a really high level and really solid. But once we deliver that, then we have to know which kids do not learn that. And we'll talk about some assessment, Dr. Harwood can. We can screen, and if someone screens, we might give them additional assistance. We call that tier 2. So I get my classroom experience, I may get some additional experience. If someone doesn't respond to that, because that may be because I wasn't read to, I have a limited vocabulary, I'm just behind, those kids will catch up pretty quickly. But those that don't, we say they're going to need more intensive instruction, we call that tier 3. A lot of those kids are dyslexic, or they have something, maybe a lower IQ. They have something that's getting in the way of them rapidly catching on to what other kids are catching on to. And they're going to need more time and more intensive instruction and more skilled instruction at that level. And that's where we're going to catch the kids that are, that would be what we'd call dyslexic kids. Now, I can tell you that spectrum is wide. So some dyslexic kids just need some focus on that tier 1 being more phonics and phonemic awareness based and more structured, and they will get that. Others need, again, just a few repetitions, but some are severe and will need more time and more effort. So what we have is, once we screen and know that data, then we know how to help kids, which appropriate way in which we can help kids. But all that comes back to if I'm trained on how to do it, which comes back to this training protocol we're trying to get in place first.
Thank you very much. I encourage you to continue to direct at-risk money to getting kids to read, because I think there's no indicator of at-risk that is greater than failure to be able to read. So I thank you for your testimony.
You know, this weekend, Representative Hill, my 4-year-old granddaughter was over visiting, and I'm thinking about all the phonemic awareness things. You know, what does she know already? What does she not know? And I'm not my wife is an elementary person, but we were just talking about, you know, what even do we do to encourage the letter development, sound, letter correspondence, and what would be appropriate for her to have in her continued development.
There is a high responsibility being a grandparent. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You are getting the look. Representative Steele, McNorton, Brantley, and then we'll circle back to Representative Schreiber unless there's anybody still looking for their first bite at the apple. Okay. Representative Steele?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Watson, thank you for being here today. I just want it known that we have a literacy issue in our schools and in our students right now. I spent all summer and fall campaigning on our students needing to be able to do math, have basic writing, and read. But I'm very concerned when you're standing here testifying using the words, quote, think we can do this, and quote, if we have the ways to do this. So can you please tell me the benchmarks that your team is putting together to ensure that we can do this? Because think and if are very concerning.
Well, I say that because a researcher would tell you that you need compelling evidence when you make a statement that this, if we do A, B will certainly occur. Dr. Harwood's going to go over with you, I think, some assessments that will get more in depth of how we'll measure this. However, we're committed to lowering the number of students in level 1. We're committed to that. And we're putting forth what research would tell us are the best training methods to do that, and then the best coaching methods of literacy coaches, the best training on top of that, and then bringing higher ed and other partners in to do that work. So that's the plan of action that we've attached to do that work. And research would indicate to us if that work is done well, we will see that reduction. That's what we do know.
Representative Steele, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, ma'am, I do. Is it okay to ask?
Quickly.
Okay, Dr. Watson, are you aware that districts are paying their faculty contract hours because these trainings are taking so long? I've got information from my districts that it's an inordinate amount of homework that these trainings are requiring, and so they are having to spend money on this. And it was my understanding from testimony of Dr. Lane that this shouldn't be costing districts anything.
Well, so there's several ways in which I want to answer that. Some districts have done this on district professional development days, and so they have built that in. Others have not. Some have then paid for letters training, especially when they still had COVID relief money left. Others did not. So we have paid as a state the training cost, but not any cost related to a stipend to the teachers. So I will say that across the state, we see some that have done that, Representative Steele, and then others that have not done that. So it's a mixed bag.
And I'm going to hop in and clarify. There's two different things occurring at the same time. One is what Dr. Watson is doing through the KSDE, and the other is what Dr. Lane is proposing through the the task force budget. So she was referring to her budget, which is different than what Dr. Watson controls. Do you find that a fair differentiation? Okay. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a question on the 25 million that the feds gave us to start this program. So out of the 3,718 teachers who have completed the letters training and the other 9,700 who are enrolled, is that 25 million paying for those 13,400?
Up to, so we haven't spent all that. Yes, it's going toward that. It's paying for their training.
So it will cover the
Those 18,000 educators, it will cover those.
So why do we need another 40 million coming up for the centers if we're going to have enough in the feds to train everybody?
So
I know that's maybe not your department. We're two different, but if we have enough money from the Fed to train everybody, then why do we need the other centers for learning to spend another $40 million if we've already got the money from the Fed?
So I don't,
Maybe that's for
I don't
Dr.
pretend
Lane.
to be Dr. Lane, but I will say this, because we work closely with the Blueprint and Dr. Lane, and we're on that committee. That is to take us beyond the initial training. The center work is to take us beyond the initial training.
Okay, thank you.
Your question actually makes me want to say, what is the cost per license, and do the math on that. But Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Watson, for being here. I have a first question. How many school districts have teachers taking letters right now?
I'd have to get that data to you, but the vast majority are doing it right now or have done it.
Guesstimate.
I didn't bring that data with me.
Half?
Oh, no. Yeah, I think you're approaching. Yeah, I'm going to say well above that number. We're looking at the individual educator more than.
Sure.
than where that
So
came from.
within that district, would you agree that the teachers that are taking the letters are placed in the schools, elementary schools or so forth within those districts?
Yes, that is correct.
So correct me if I'm wrong, and I totally think that letters in this program is fabulous. I think it is providing, when you talk to teachers, it is providing that resource and a good support to teach kids how to read. My feeling is you already have established the centers in Kansas because you already are taking letters out to your districts, and those teachers are in the schools. Our candidates at the higher ed that are needing to be able to go out to the schools and jump in and be a teacher on day one can get that rich experience by being part of your centers that are already engaged in teaching reading. Am I correct?
Well, certainly they can have a student teaching experience, and they can join us at any point in that endeavor. I think, again, I'm not the expert on the reading centers, but I think the concept of the reading centers is to take us beyond the initial training and give us a place where advanced training can take place over time, and also help students and families that are really severe. But I don't disagree with you that in Osborne, Kansas, if that staff's going through and someone from Fort Hays State wants to go to Osborne and be a part of that, with that staff, that there would be a great learning experience that would go on.
So when we have pre-service teachers that are online or maybe place-bound in their own community, they could actually use their community as their center to engage in teaching reading and letters.
Sure, they can volunteer, if they want to also.
Without having to build a center.
Well,
They're established already.
Well, I wouldn't call what they proposed in that center to be the same, Representative, but I think if you're asking, can they get great knowledge by doing that and wherever they're located, the answer is yes.
So the overall arching goal of this entire Blueprint for Literacy project is to what?
It's to expand literacy across Kansas. It's to expand our efforts there.
So if I'm a pre-service candidate and I go out to a school and I engage in teaching reading, am I doing that?
Yes, you are.
That's all I need. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess probably my comment might be both to the commissioner and then to my friend from Finney County. I have to agree with them that, we did have a kind of a fad teaching reading here in the last several years, or decades, really. I can bring in our son, who's 39 now. He's a professional engineer, dyslexic. And I still remember sitting on the couch with him, yelling at him that how to say the word the, T-H-E. He couldn't. It was just impossible for him. And that's what spurred my wife to be trained in structured literacy and start her own center to teach teachers and kids that have dyslexia. I think the department, and this isn't, I'm not blaming Commissioner or anyone else at the department, but I think they didn't catch on fast enough on this years ago. I think this blueprint is probably the first time that I've seen up here, and I've been up here quite a while, to have both the teacher prep and the classroom implementation blended together to teach literacy from start to finish. And it's not something that you start and it ends. There's continual training after that. There's, as Commissioner said, there's different levels of dyslexia and people, there are tough students to get trained, and they need people to come in from the outside to say, here, try this aspect of it. So I just want to make that clarification. I think you're right. I wouldn't be surprised that your wife said, what is this, another fad that we're going to have to try. But this program, structured literacy, is based on almost 100 years of data, and the other one was not. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to have Representative McNorton ask the last question on this section before we move to the next portion, unless I see anybody, not seeing anyone. Close this out.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So do you guys, any one of you, have any idea, do any of our school districts have all of their teachers trained, and how, those, we got to see more results quicker out of those that you can go look at to see, the school district number one has them all trained now, and 2 years from, I'm just curious if
Yes.
you know that data.
Yes, we do. I'll give you one close by, Shawnee Heights. Trained every one of their staff members. And that just finished. So we should start to see, and the results there are pretty good compared to the state. We should start to see that even move further. The next question that we would ask of Shawnee Heights, are your instructional materials aligned to structured literacy? Because if they're not, we got to get that done. But we should start to see that happen.
Okay, so you guys are going to track Shawnee Heights more than you will whoever else who hasn't done that.
So it kind of goes back to Representative Steele's question. We're looking at data, and we've got some partners, researchers looking at data like that, and where are we getting our biggest bang, return on investment? We're looking at all that, but yes. And that's why I say we're seeing some small improvement now, but we think that improvement's going to accelerate as we get more people trained and with the right materials.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Randy, before I let you off the hot seat, I think you raised a topic in actually authentic letters materials, and I know that's something that the task force is also talking about. Is it best to go through you guys or through legislative research to find out book balances? Because I know districts collect money, the book fees. If districts, I want an understanding of how poised districts are to replace their reading materials to,
We do have that.
okay, thank you. And I think it would be helpful when we look at the state assessments later in the year that we see if you guys could do some sampling of movement that we see in districts that are further along in their letters training, somewhat along, and not along at all. And let's see if we're beginning to see what we hope to see.
And we'll be happy to share that with you later in the year. We also can tell you that coming out of the pandemic, we've seen more school districts move to adopting structured literacy, science of reading materials than we did pre. So there's been that movement. Again, all this is early stages of what the research will say will start to move that needle on those students, as Representative Steele asked. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Dr. Watson, a request was just made by Representative Brantley if there's some kind of a manual or something, or maybe a scope and sequence that from letters that members could look at, since I'm not sure that everybody has used letters.
We'd be happy to get that to you, Madam Chair, and you could distribute that to them.
Thank you very much. And I'll say letters has been highly responsive because we had some questions about a few things, and they came and sat down and talked to me, and I think they're very open to hearing all of our questions. Are you ready? We're finally ready for you.
I am happy to be here, Madam Chair. Frank Harwood, Deputy Commissioner for the Kansas State Department of Education. Here to talk a little bit about assessments, which I think was a question the last time Dr. Watson was here, and I was not here for that, but I think I have some idea of the questions, but I'm happy to either answer on top of the things that I have here or bring back other information. So I submitted his testimony last week. I think got provided to everyone, basically a glossary of assessments. And so the first one, and this was, I think, one of the conversations, were universal screeners. And so the State Department or the State Board of Education requires a dyslexia screener 3 times a year, K through 8. And so a lot of districts have adopted FastBridge as that screener. And with some pandemic funds, the State Department of Education is underwriting a portion of the cost of FastBridge. Those funds will run out in 2026, and then districts will be responsible for paying for their screener on their own. Not every district uses that. That's a district choice, what screener they use, but it has to be an approved screener to do that. And the reason that happens is we're just trying to, the screeners do a couple of different things. FastBridge, for instance, talks about risk factors. And so it will talk about whether a student is at high risk, medium risk, or low risk of being behind with reading. And so those screeners are done in the classroom with everybody in class. They usually are relatively short, 20 to 30 minutes per subject. There's reading and math both in there, so those are done 3 times a year. So students don't miss instructional time away from the rest of the class, but it does take time. Every assessment we do takes time. A student that would show up as at high risk would probably then move on to a diagnostic test. And so a diagnostic test typically is pretty short. And a lot of times what would happen is a student would be taken out into the hallway with a reading specialist or a reading aide, and they would be given, a lot of times, a verbal test on having them read passages to somebody. So you can actually hear what they're doing. And from that diagnostic test, after a meeting, typically with what's called a student improvement team, that's one example, they're named different things everywhere. They would decide whether or not that student needed something in addition to Tier 1. So Randy talked about with multi-tiered systems of support, Tier 1 is what everybody gets. If they're flagged in the screener and they go through the diagnostic, they'll talk about, well, do we need to be doing something different? That could be a pull-out service, that could be a push-in service, it just depends on what it is. And that brings up the next type of assessment, which is called progress monitoring. What you do is that if you implement an intervention, so that we're gonna, whatever it is, reading, math, whatever it is, we're gonna start doing this extra thing for this student or this group of students, and then you progress monitor. That's determined based on what it is. Sometimes you progress monitor weekly, depending on the intensity. Sometimes it could be monthly. That gets determined by that teacher team and the group that's implementing the intervention, with a lot of input from basically what that intervention is. So those are kind of the progress of universal screener to diagnostic to progress monitoring. Once progress monitoring shows that the student no longer needs the intervention, they'd still be taking the screeners every so often, but they may not be being pulled out or receiving that intervention after the time. You continue to check that over time to see if that intervention holds. Sometimes you see improvement, but once you stop the intervention, they can slide back, and so that's why you continue to do the interventions throughout K through 8. The next kind of assessments we're going to talk about are really just the kind of assessments that kind of work for everybody, and the first one are formative assessments. And so formative assessments are the assessments that teachers use to inform their instruction. And these can be very informal. This could be a quiz a teacher gives at the end of the day. Sometimes they talk about like exit tickets. And so a teacher will ask a student to do one thing about that lesson and turn that in. And it's very quick. And it's how much of what I tried to teach today did kids pick up on. And so they can be a more formal formative assessment. Some districts have what they call common formative assessments. So this would be something that every teacher in the district gives the same test in the same time period. These are used in a different way in that groups of teachers typically talk about that, about how are our students doing moving through the standards that go along. Formative assessments need to be tied to some learning, which would be the standard for either a section or a quarter or just that class period. The next type we'll talk about are interim assessments, and these are sometimes they're talked about as benchmark tests. And so some districts' common formative assessments might actually be interim tests because we're looking at this period of time, maybe it's the first quarter. How did we do on learning the standards that we said should be covered during the first quarter? Understanding that that's a longer time, and so going back to 8 weeks ago is harder to do than it was, well, did you learn it today, and how am I going to change my lesson plan for tomorrow? And so it's a longer period of time, typically much larger scale. And then the last type are summative assessments, and summative, just what it means, it's at the end. And so when you give a summative assessment, that's typically not used for individual student learning. That's more systems-wide. Now, in some cases, if you think about like a college final, that would be a summative assessment that goes into your grade, but it doesn't matter whether you got it or not, you're done. So that's where summative assessments are. A lot of times people talk about, whereas a formative assessment is more of a checkup, a summative assessment is more of an autopsy, because you're not going to go back and change anything that's happened. State assessments, the ones we talk about, are summative assessments because they're given at the end of the school year, and teachers don't really get results in a time where they could go back and say, hey, this group of third graders did not learn this, didn't do well on this standard, I'm going to go back and reteach it. There's really not time to do that. What they can do is say, hey, my third graders last year didn't do as well on this standard as I thought they would. So what am I going to do different next year to help the next group? The problem with that sometimes is that that next group may or may not need the same thing coming through. So summative assessments are more systems checks and less individual student checks, except for something like a final exam, which would also be a summative, which goes into a grade. So when it comes to the actual state assessment program, which was the second page of what I sent, so what we have is the Kansas assessment program, and we talk about a balanced system, a balanced assessment system. And so there are 3 parts to the Kansas assessment system. The one we talk about the most is the summative, which is that test in the spring. The other 2 parts are interims and mini tests. And so mini tests are much more teacher-driven. So they use the same platform as the state assessments. The advantage to that is that you're helping students get familiarity with the system so that when they're taking the test at the end, it's not the first time they've ever tried to do that. If you've ever had to take it, actually to perform on any type of assessment when you didn't get to practice at all, that's harder. And sometimes your results are tied into how well you could understand the system that you were supposed to be using. So the mini tests help with that, but then they also give the teacher information about the standards that they were trying to cover during that time and how well the students did on that. The mini tests would roll up into an interim. The difference between mini and interim tests, the state determines when those can be given and what those are. And so they're much larger, but they can be used by districts to think about how are we progressing towards the summative assessment. So the mini tests are much more classroom-oriented, teacher-oriented. The interim tests would be much more how are we doing on the standards we should have covered so far to move forward. Sometimes the problems with the interim is that if we haven't covered that standard yet, you're probably not going to do very well on it. And so you have to be able to kind of tease that out of, if we didn't cover that standard, our results probably aren't as good. How do we move forward with that? And so those are basically the types of assessments. The only thing I forgot to cover, I started with the universal. Diagnostic screeners and progress monitoring would all be the responsibility of each school district. And so there's no state funding for any of those. So it'd be a combination of state and federal funds. So there's no state specific funding. So it would come out of general funds. It may be that you could use, if it meets the needs for at-risk funding, they could use that. In some cases, it could be title funding, depending on how all those work together. Formative assessments are the same way, except for the mini tests. The mini tests are part of the Kansas assessment program, so they could use those. But a lot of times there are formative tests that come with materials curriculum materials that they may be purchasing, and so they go along with those materials. Interim assessments, districts have developed those at their own expense, but then there's also the interim assessment that's part of the Kansas assessment program, which they would not have additional cost for. And then the state assessment, the summative assess, of course, is funded by the state and federal funds. If they have their own end of course exams, those would have been either a part of instructional materials that they purchased or something that they've put together on their own. And with that, I will see how close I came to the questions that people actually had.
So, Dr. Harwood, thank you so much for providing this information, because I think we get to talking and we're talking about different tests almost interchangeably sometimes. And this is a lovely, well put together cheat sheet for us, and it will be staying in my education binder. I will open up for questions. Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Harwood, for being here. Can you go back again to that overarching goal for the Blueprint for Literacy is to do what?
So I am less of an expert on the Blueprint for Literacy than Dr. Watson is, but I believe what he talked about was to improve literacy statewide.
Okay, so improving literacy statewide. How many districts have FastBridge in Kansas?
I'd have to get the exact number, but because it was, because it's the cost of it is currently being supplemented a lot, a majority.
So the last time I spoke to FastBridge, I believe it was 190 districts, and this was a couple years ago, and 330,000 students, and the state was paying $6 of the $12 per student to use FastBridge. So we have a substantial number of districts in Kansas using FastBridge. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I did not look at those numbers before I come, but it sounds close, if not exact.
So if we have that many schools assessing using FastBridge, would you say that's a good representation for a assessment piece to be used with students for reading?
So if I understand your question, so we think that the FastBridge data can give a good statewide picture of I guess, how that screener works. So, yes?
So correct me if I'm wrong, FastBridge is an at-risk assessment of whether students might fall below grade level?
So, so FastBridge does not, it's not grade level, but so the three things that come back are high risk for not progressing, medium risk, and low risk. So a student who is performing at, although they don't talk about grade level, but performing well for someone their age would be considered low risk, even if they are way above where you would expect somebody to be there. They'd still just be considered low risk.
Does FastBridge provide reports for the teachers to use to see the progress of the student as they're working with progress monitoring or benchmarking 3 times a year?
So FastBridge would not be considered progress monitoring because it's not tied to a specific intervention. But yes, teachers would be able to see how that student progressed from the beginning of the year to the end. And what you would be looking at is reducing the number of students that were considered at high risk or low risk and moving more students into or medium risk to low risk. So yes, you'll see that at a student level for every classroom.
So FastBridge does not progress monitor?
So, so in a technical sense, no, because it's not tied to a specific intervention. Progress monitoring typically is, if we were going to put this intervention in place for this amount of time, you're going to measure much more discrete skills, and so FastBridge doesn't do that. There will be people who think that they are progress monitoring and measuring growth. They're just different things when you look at, I guess, the technical definitions of them. Progress monitoring typically is a very, very discrete standard or skill that you're working on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understood what I just heard. So we're using FastBridge to kind of say, here's where we are. Sometimes it's going to be a little low because the skill hasn't been taught yet. That's true?
So FastBridge is not necessarily skills-based, and which is one of the things that you have to, so there are skills that you're talking about, but it's talking about what the risk level is for that student to, and although they do not use the term grade level, and I'm trying not to, but whether they're in a place where they should be on track at their age, because a lot of times it's more age-based than grade-based.
Thank you. And I kind of wish it did tell us if a kid is exceeding, because I think sometimes we miss the kids who are doing something really well, and we could make their school experience better by catching that and adjusting. I think it's important to adjust both ways. Do we have more questions? Representative Pishney and then Chauncey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this may be your question or Randy's question, I'm not sure, but first of all, I have some issues that I'd like to discuss with people well, I don't want to use the word offline, I don't like that phrase, but offline, because I have difficulty with pre-tests and practice tests and all that stuff, and I'd like to discuss that sometime. But my question is around the tests. I'm not a test taker. I can tell you what my subject matter is, and I can go out and practice it. And I know people who have taken the test for becoming a teacher who have failed that test several times, but they would absolutely be great teachers. And I know that's more than just the reading that we're talking about specifically. But is there any consideration for those who know it, can go out and teach it, can help our kids read better, but they just can't take that final test?
So, so now we're shifting to licensure more. So the state board, along with the teacher licensure, have explored and tried to work with pre-service teachers that aren't making that. There's a lot of, so I don't know if you want to answer that one.
Excuse me for interrupting. And yes, that is a part of what I was asking, but I was directing it more to, I heard you say there's a test at the end of letters or something. So I was talking specifically about the tests that we're doing for this reading project, if you will.
Yeah, so if there is a margin of error, and if someone's within that margin of error on the testing, they can go before a professional standards board made up of teachers. They can examine recommendations from the administrator, recommendations, in this case, college professor, and that board would vote yes or no whether to accept the non-score, if you would, and place that person.
Okay, yes, that's what I was specifically asking. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. I have Representative Chauncey, then Hill. Do I have any other questions?
Thank you, Madam.
Brantley, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quick question. How do we, I guess my questions, and then maybe you don't have the answer for this, but I mean, how do we address the more intensive instruction for our high-risk students and stuff with the shortage of teachers we have? And with that being said, also along those same lines, the lack of attendance of some of our students and no enforcement, and then also the lack of parental involvement. I mean, that was a concern. I went and visited with their Blue Ribbon School there in Junction this morning, and that was some of the educators' primary concerns, was getting the kids to school to get the training they need. It doesn't matter what we implement if we can't get the kids there and have attendance to get them to learn what they need to learn.
So I guess I'd answer that by school districts are working with students with non-academic concerns. So chronic absenteeism is also on the list to determine that a student is at risk. And so in that situation, I mean, you may look at some of the test scores, but if they are really chronically absent, that's probably not going to be surprising. And so the interventions that you would look at would be tied to how do we get them to come to school. And some of that is outreach to parents, it's outreach, but I will tell you it's difficult because school personnel typically don't go pick up students and bring them, though I will tell you that's happened in the past. It is trying to help parents make sure that students are getting to school. And so there are a number of, behavior issues also can have you be considered at risk. Wouldn't show up on a universal screener typically. It's showing up because of interventions with those behaviors, but then you start looking at interventions to help the student be more successful. Districts doing that is hampered by staffing issues. Because if you can't find enough teachers to teach all of your elementary classes, elementary teachers are one of the areas that we're short on, then it's hard to have this extra teacher that you could fund using at-risk funds to be able to help students in that area. So they do the best that they can with the staffing that they have. And some of that you get more creative with non-certified staff. So paraeducators, whether special education or general education. But for the most part, what you do is that you look at each student individually, you try to come up with a plan that you can implement, and then make the best of that situation as you move forward.
With that being said, so are we getting accurate data, though, with the students not being on regular attendance if they are chronically absent from school? I mean, wouldn't that be a little bit misleading data as far as, testing those kids because they haven't had an opportunity to that education? And also with that, I mean, when I went to school 40 years ago in South Dakota, if you missed 2-3 days in a row, you'd have a truancy officer out talking to your parents, figuring out why your kid's not in school. I don't know if that's something we do in Kansas, but it seems to me that we should also be focused on making sure that our kids do get to the schools and making a requirement that the parents, holding the parents accountable to get our kids to the education system so we can bring those scores up.
I saw two parts to your question there. One is the truancy aspect. So school districts can turn students in as truant. And if they are, now I'm going to forget the age, but if they're younger students, it's turned into DCF. And older students turned into the county attorney. Schools don't have a lot of say in what happens after that. Some counties are much better than other counties about moving forward with that. When it comes to are we getting an accurate representation of the students' abilities on summative assessments if they've missed half the school year, I would say no. Because now you're going to get an accurate assessment of what they know at that point, but it's probably not a fair assessment of what they would have known if they would have come to school. And so we work on those things, but I think that's one of those reasons why when you look at, when Dr. Watson talked about, we think we can cut level 1 in half and moving forward, That's the half that we're thinking that it's because something that we could do a better job of helping them learn to read will move them quickly. The students that have, I mean, when you look at level 1, of the vast majority of special education students take the regular state assessment. Only 2% or less take an alternate assessment. And so those are students with learning disabilities and several other things that are taking that assessment. Those students, we will continue to work with them at their level moving forward. Same would be true for students that are behind because they have not regularly attended school for, in some cases, a number of years. And so that's one of the reasons why getting 0 students in level 1 is probably not functionally possible. But certainly we try to help every student move as far as they can.
Thank you, Representative Hill, and then Representative Brantley. Anybody else would like to get in the queue?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Frank, I was watching up here on the closed captioning a little bit ago, and it listed you as Dr. Harvard.
I've been called a lot worse.
I think I'm going to start calling you that. That's got a nice ring to it. So a couple questions. First one's kind of quick. When you're talking about the identification for at-risk, I believe, was that, or dyslexia, or both? Or, I mean, when you described that scenario where kids are first evaluated in the classroom and then evaluated separately, was that for at-risk, or is that for specifically dyslexia?
So the requirement is a dyslexia screener 3 times a year. If a student, even if they're not dyslexic, shows up on that screener as at high risk, a school could designate them as an at-risk student, and then that would open up spending of at-risk funds on programs and services that they would receive. Because dyslexia is on the list specifically, but also not performing at grade level would be another reason. So schools use the screener, whether it's dyslexia or not, to show, well, this student has high risk of not performing well in reading. So we're going to use these interventions that could be funded with at-risk funds.
What type of factors do they look at when they're doing the in-class screening?
Well, I would say this goes back a little bit to Representative Chauncey's issue of that, or actually Fishney's question about not everybody's a good test taker. And a 5-year-old isn't necessarily ready to take that test that day. And so that screener is just that's just, hey, let's see what's there. The diagnostic that follows up with that may say, hey, there's nothing wrong with this. And the team may say, well, we're not going to do anything. We're going to wait and see what happens at the next screener because it is just that day. There would be students that never test well on FastBridge, but their classroom performance is such that they don't necessarily move on to tier 2 because they're keeping up and excelling. And this is when I talk to teacher groups about this, you have to be smarter than the data. I mean, this is one point of data. You've got everything else, which is why it goes to a team to decide before you start talking about let's pull somebody out for this intervention or that intervention. So the teachers that are working with that student are making those decisions as they move forward.
So that initial screening is just pretty much observation then?
So it would be a single data point that most districts would have some sort of scale of, if you fall into this, then we do this. But that would be some sort of diagnostic and follow-up. It wouldn't necessarily mean we're going to put you in this class or that class.
Okay. The second question, you mentioned, if I may, yeah. Okay, you mentioned that the state assessments, the summative state assessments are funded through federal and state money. What is the total price tag that we pay for state assessments?
So just put this
including
together.
The federal money?
I just put this together for a PowerPoint that I was going to give on Thursday. So these numbers will be close. It's a total of almost $7 million. $1.4 million is state funding. The rest is federal funding.
Okay. And that includes the distribution and the tabulation and all that? So and the development too?
Yeah, so that would be for the ELA assessment, the math assessment, the science assessment, and KELPA, which is for English language learners.
So it seems like sometimes in the past I've seen a line item in the budget where when we're developing it, we spend more money on it. Is that correct or not? Or validating?
So I will tell you that Kansas is typically 49th or 50th on per student assessment expenditures. So as a rule, we spend very little on our state assessments.
Okay. And then the question that really just jumps out when you talk about that they can't be used for this and they can't be used for that, what are they valid for?
State assessments?
Yes.
So, I mean, state assessments are more an indicator of the system that goes on. I mean, as Commissioner Washington talked about, when we look at the number of students in level 1 and reading, that's too high, and we should use those numbers to look at progress in having more students getting into levels 2, 3, and 4. It's not a great indicator of the individual. It's not a great use of the student's individual abilities, because by the time we've given the test, we're not going to go back and reteach those skills. Now, if I am a 4th grade teacher, I'll look at the 3rd grade assessments for my students and kind of figure out, okay, what were the standards they didn't do well on? And then that may inform how I'm going to look at my overall approach to the class. But from an individual student, once you get the screeners done again and start doing some diagnostics, but you could look at the students that are in level 1 and say, hey, I'm going to pay special attention to these students as I'm learning what they need to be ready at the end of this school year.
Okay, thank you for that. Are the state assessments required by the federal government?
So the federal government requires that we test ELA and math in grades 3 through 8 and 1 grade in high school. State law requires that we test those at 3 grades.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Harvard.
Thank you, Representative Hill. Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again, Dr. Harwood. Dr. Harwood, in Fastbridge, are there a subset of reading skills assessed for students at K1?
So there are 2 separate Fastbridge tests. I don't remember the names of them, but one is, I think, K1, and then the other one is 2 and above. So it's actually a separate test, and the scores look somewhat different.
Within that subset of K1, aren't there like 6 skill tests for the early reading skills?
I don't remember that off the top of my head. It's been a while since I've looked at them.
Okay. And then from grades 2 through 8, do they take the CBM auto reading and A reading tests?
A reading is typically what they take.
Okay. So if they take the 2 tests, have you seen the screening to intervention report?
Not for at least 4 years when I was, or actually 3 years when I was still in a school district.
So I guess my question would be, if they're tutoring and working with students in reading and they've assessed those sub-skills at K1 and then 2A, in 2A, if they take the 2 benchmarks, they can access that screening to intervention report, which has like a 99% accurate reading after they've taken 2 benchmarkings as to whether that student will meet the benchmark at the end of the year. Is that pretty accurate?
That sounds correct, but I have not looked at that for quite
So it's pretty reliable for assessing how reading teaching is going, correct?
I would say that Fastbridge has done a lot of research on their tests, and so and the validity of it is fairly high.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a whole new set of vocabulary happening over there that I need to learn. Can we have that paper too? Representative Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Hardwood, thank you for your information today. With Fastbridge being in use for the dyslexics, and isn't letters supposed to be helping with that? So is there a correlation, hoping we may not need to have to administer this so many times throughout the year because letters is going to be so effective?
So I don't know that the two are tied together as directly as you stated. So we would expect, especially for the upper grades, that with implementation of letters, we would see fewer students that would be at high risk and more students that would be at low risk. That's probably not true at K1, maybe even K2, K1, 2, because we're still in the very beginnings of teaching reading. So we should be able to see with FastBridge that the effectiveness of letters intervention, but that wouldn't necessarily take away, I guess, the reasons for the assessments. I mean, the frequency of the assessments could be revisited. That's what after the dyslexia task force recommendations, that's what the state board put in place.
Representative Steele, do you have a follow-up?
I do not. Thank you for the information.
Thank you. Dr. Harwood, I'm last, so sorry about that. I'm sitting here thinking, looking at this list, and I see it's laid out kind of in a progression. And I remember when my children were in school getting some of these progress reports. Do you know which one of these have reports that are shared with parents? Is it all?
So, so the summative assessment, the state summative assessment does. FastBridge does have a screener that certainly can be shared with parents. And I know that in the last district I was in, we did that. The diagnostics probably don't have a report that comes out, I mean, just because they're so different, but that would be information that would be shared with parents as you're helping the parent understand the interventions that you're using. It's just that whereas FastBridge actually has a report you can print, some of the other ones are much simpler, and so they may not have a kind of a fancy report, but certainly that's information that could be shared with parents.
Okay, are the formative and interims shared with parents?
We'll have to get back with, so the formatives, I'm going to say that some of those are very short, just teacher-driven things, so they probably are not shared with parents on a regular basis, though certainly could be during parent-teacher conferences and those kinds of things, or if there is an issue, there were. I'll have to get back with you on the interims and the minis that are part of the state assessment process to see if there's a report that's available to parents from that. Any of the district ones that are solely district level, I would be reluctant to answer because that would vary by what it is and vary district to district.
And I think that's fair. I remember getting these reports, and I remember getting very specific information on what they were doing well on and where they needed to focus. What I don't remember ever getting is maybe a link or something somewhere to here are things you can do with your child or sample things. And I don't think we've ever really talked about it, but I hope that's something that I think that would help because we struggle because we have a certain amount of parents who aren't engaged and we have some parents who are engaged, but they're not education majors. So for those who want to help, and I think that might drive some of the parents who aren't engaged to feel like, okay, now I know what I can sit down and do with my child. So that was the thought process behind my question. It'd be nice if we got to that point, and I'm not sure what vendor along the line is the one to ask for that. So thank you very much. I appreciate you being here, sharing things with us. I am still a little bit confused on the universal because I think your answer to Representative Brantley is there are 6 skills that are tested with K1, but you kind of told me that it's not skills-based, so I don't feel like I have a good picture in my mind of what it looks like. Could we see FastBridge sometime?
That I don't know because I don't know how proprietary FastBridge is. We could certainly try to get information about what each test tries to cover. The universal part of the screening means that every student takes part in it, whereas diagnostic, and we move to those that not every student does. So that's where the universal word comes in there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Any last questions for Dr. Harwood? Okay, he's relieved. I just wanted to go over the rest of the schedule with you. Tomorrow, we have the report card, so you will get to see Dr. Harwood here again, and we also will have Rebecca Gerhart from DCF. And, you know, we've all been at this a while, and we know that foster care children are not doing how we want them to do. So part of our point tomorrow is to hear that information. Additionally, I'm hoping that we have some solid discussion on things we haven't thought of and how we change that. Wednesday, I really would like to call out to you that our meeting is in the old Supreme Court room, 346 South. We get to celebrate the Kansas Teacher of the Year and the regional finalist. Looking forward to that. So we will meet there and not here. Thursday, we will have, for lack of a better term, I'm kind of calling it financial assistance. I think as a state, we have a lot of different things that we do to help children realize there's a path for you if you want to pursue post-secondary. There are paths for you, even while you're in high school, to get certifications, to get to get credit for things that you're learning at work when they overlap, or even in your hobbies like 4-H. And I want us to, number one, be aware of what those are, and number two, also look at that from a holistic point of, great, these are things that we were doing, but what aren't we doing? What might be missing? And then Friday, right now, I think we are going to conflict with another meeting, so at this time, think it is not likely that we will meet on Friday. But I'm not saying that 100% sure, so that if that changes, you're not coming after me, because I told you something different. Any questions for the good of the order? All right, seeing none, we are adjourned.